very much for giving me time.
Very well.
It's very much appreciated. Carl's just informed me that you are a big name on the digital scene. I was sort of thinking about the scene out there. But your time is appreciated. I'm sure you've read some of the brief about what we're doing.
Yeah.
My role as independent chair at the University of Huddersfield. I'm being paid by the Kirklees Council. I've worked with them for 10 years or so on youth citizenship. And I think that what they're doing is both laudable in terms of its timing and its ambition.
Me too.
Particularly what's happening in England in terms of regional devolution and reform of local government, but also in the context of what's happened in June. I think that that shift in political culture, there is clearly a different tone to the way in which politics is being discussed. So far, we have a 20-month meeting with local citizens across Kirklees. During the next month, we're spending lots of time in attractive rooms such as this. We're in London. We've been here for 2 days. We're going to Manchester. We're also taking a number of evidence sessions in Kirklees itself, stakeholders from a broad range. And then we will bring those thoughts together in October, November. We're going to write up some draft recommendations. And we're very keen that all our stakeholders, all the people who have been involved in this, will not only input on our recommendations and comment on them, but also in many ways buy into the eventual report, which will be delivered to the Commission, to Council in December, then disseminated both nationally and locally. I think it's appropriate if you just want to introduce yourself to all the Commission as a whole.
Yep. So I'm Dr. Catherine Howe. My specialism is around digital democracy and digital engagement, and actually how those two things come together rather than we do engagement in one place and democracy in another. I'm also a sort of an expert around digital leadership, and I'm very fascinated by how big things change and how we make sure that in public service reform we're designing democracy in rather than making democracy an extra cost and sits on the outside. So I'm really impressed by what you guys are wrestling with here, because not everybody is sitting at the profound level that you're doing and thinking about these kind of problems. So yes, so I'm that's me.
Thanks for putting more weight on this than you know.
No, nobody else is really thinking about this stuff properly at the moment. So
well, I've got to say that both the councillors and all the parties have bought into this, which has been deeply refreshing and much appreciated, but also that the officers within Kirklees Council have driven this, and it is very timely. I think it's an important piece of work. With the rest of the council,
Christina Fardier, elected member of the Kirklees Council and member of Commission.
Councillor Cathy Scott, member of the Commission. Diane, my role is doing the online content for the Commission.
We know. Vice Chancellor, we know.
Andrew Bolverman, Kirklees Councillor, member of the Commission.
Andrew Marchington, member of the Commission.
To start off with, it's probably the question which is most difficult to answer is one that you'll have seen in your briefing paper, where we're thinking about these tensions and these opportunities between representative participative democracy. Where does deliberative democracy fit in within that sort of paradigm? I wonder whether you have any thoughts about how we understand those tensions and some sort of initial thoughts on potential resolution.
Yeah. So I think that there's a starting point here, which is that I'm a sociologist, so I take a long view of these things, which is that I think you've got to situate this within the fact that we're moving from an industrial to a network society, and that big epoch shift is quite a big part of what you guys are wrestling with, because we've got a representative democracy which was based on an idea that decisions were made by sending a man on a horse to London. And firstly, it's not a man anymore, but secondly, necessarily, but secondly, that actually the real-time way in which we can make decisions, and the fact that decisions don't have 2 or 3 years to flow through a system because real-time change is possible and necessary, means that we need to be thinking about this from the context of what democracy do we need if we are in a networked and digital society which is constantly changing, where public services are morphing in real time, because if you've got a decent digital strategy, you don't put one big website release live every 2 years, you're constantly and incrementally improving it. So I know that's a big set of statements, but the sort of the backdrop here is that we need real-time democracy, but we also still, I believe, need representative democracy, because there are big and wicked issues that can only be wrestled with by a small number of trusted people, and that democratic mandate to do that is really, really important. So for me, the question is, how do you create a democracy stack which allows for participatory and very direct democracy for very closely bounded decisions, but which then recognises when you need to move into a more deliberative space of trade-offs and that you need a deliberative function, but also then recognises that ultimately there are some things which will need to be dealt with at that representative level. And in building that stack, identifying where do we need to design more democracy in to the way in which we're thinking about public services. So you will probably have had some people talking to you about evidence-based policy making, or sort of open policy making and things like that. Has that come up over the... Now, I think that in a digital world, one of the issues there is that it allows for an awful lot of drift between how you're thinking and how you're doing. And so by making sure that you're thinking about designing democratic accountability and engagement into a more granular level of how you're changing your organisation, you build that stack, you build that trust, but you also make that real-time democracy possible. So an example of this, I'm sort of a multidisciplinary kind of person, so I'm very fascinated by the fact you've got community development sits over here, and you've got comms that sits over there, and now you've got all these people doing co-design and user experience design, and they sit over there. Whereas actually, if you were to bring those people together and say, in the process of doing co-design on a website, for example, if you were also to take account of the fact that there should be a degree of democratic accountability around that co-design process, then you start to make those links between those small changes that you make on the front end of what you're doing and that bigger representative accountability, which is what we want to keep in place. Does that make sense? How these things stack together? And I think that the connectedness of doing things with digital means that we can't allow engagement and co-design and democracy and decision making to sit in different places. We have to bring them together.
I suspect the next follow-on question is do you have any sort of ideas about how you could advise the council to do that?
Yeah, so I think that the bit of the stack that's missing is the point where you say to a participatory democracy is pretty well understood, I think, and we something like participatory budgeting is kind of like, that's a nice bounded, we can do that. Is that I don't think we have explored the territory, which is what are the boundaries of participatory democracy, and how do we put a deliberative process as the next stage when actually you've got trade-offs between communities. Because what tends to happen is either the members the representatives directly manage those kind of tensions, or it ends up in a committee somewhere and gets dealt with like that. And the routing of something like that is that, okay, we've got the participatory stuff going on here, we've got members making decisions here, we're going to run a consultation engagement experience over here, but we haven't stacked it all together. Instead, if you were to say, we understand that these decisions should be taken at the community level with quite a direct democracy, but we're very clear on the things that we want to do with deliberative decision making. And to be honest, park a lot of the stuff that you do in engagement, which is not democratic and doesn't really engage people. So stop doing that and start instead to build up from more participatory direct democracy where you can do it. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm just sort of looking around. One of the things that's sort of come up with it seems to be very difficult. It's very easy to identify that, and it's very difficult to actually to bring it to body. Is how do you make those decisions about what decisions should go through one process, which is more representative, and one will take on that more democracy stack of your approach? So I believe that we need to be organising our democracy around natural community. So I think that you need to look at Kirklees and say where are the places that, okay, so if you'll excuse the language, did you ever come across a project called It's Not Fucking Dalston?
Excuse language. But so you check it out. It's brilliant. So it was a guy who couldn't work. Who when he was driving through his neighbourhood, he realised that where Dalston, the definition of Dalston was actually quite different for lots of different people. So he went up and down this particular road asking the question, "Is this Dalston?" And at some ends he got quite an abrupt response, but there was peak Dalston, where everybody agreed this is where they were. And I think community kind of works like that. People know where they live, and it's probably not a lower supra output area.
Yeah.
It's not going to fit neatly into your boundaries. It's not going to be neatly in your wards. But if you want the participatory direct democracy stuff to work, you need to make it work out of natural communities.
Yeah.
And if you've got that as your natural unit, firstly, it's a lot easier to get people to do stuff because they understand what they're connecting to. But secondly, then the deliberative stuff is anything which is outside the scope of this geography probably needs a deliberative approach, because we're going to be trading off resources or conversations or approaches or philosophy with other natural communities. And I think we've let the government structure that grew out a while ago, we've let it overwhelm those natural communities. And that's uncomfortable, and I'm really glad you've been to Bexley and had the conversation about what happens when you have fewer members or a different number of members, because keeping the representatives tight with the places where people think they actually live, I think is really important.
Yeah, that's certainly come out in some of the stuff on Sheffield and Luton.
Yeah.
The place is very important. Is it place that is the key delineator, would you say?
So, I think for the size of Kirklees, it probably is. But you are also going to have communities of interest. So you need to find a way of accommodating communities of place and community of interest. And community of interest may be community of minority interest, where you've identified that you don't want to leave a group of people behind because they might they might just be pockets of an opinion in lots of different communities. But I think actual community of people who come together and have that, so my definition of civic is where you engage with people because you've got that shared sense of place, not because you've got a shared sense of, you're there because you want to engage with that community, not because they're your friends, they're your family, or you're going to get something from them. Your civic is where you encounter people who are different to you, where your similarity is that this is the place that we live and we all care about it.
It's interesting because that's one of the things that's come out when we're talking to citizens is that Kirklees itself, 1974 manufacturing authority, in many ways they don't have that emotional tug.
No.
But it's quite clear that once you drill down,
Yeah.
Kirklees splits in both north-south and then it splits into Michael, and that place is very important to it, isn't it?
But it is different, and sort of if what we want is more participation, then we have to accept the fact that people, if people aren't motivated by a cause or a theme or an issue that really gets them out of bed in the morning, as many people who are politically active are, they are motivated by making the place that they live better. And so, it's pragmatic as well as, I think, sort of bright to focus around where do people actually live.
Yeah, yes, very interesting. I don't want to come to this point, Andrew.
Yeah, participatory budgeting has come up quite a lot.
Yeah, I bet.
But I'm just thinking, can we do a work on to explore some of what you said around something like education and the classic tension between central government and local government and schools. So how might what you're describing work if we wanted to improve educational outcomes in Kirklees?
That's a really good question. So I'm a governor of an academy, and I'm a bit sad about education policy generally, because I think it's resulted in things being disconnected from their communities rather than better connected. So one of these things about sort of participatory stacks would say, well, actually, a board of governors at a school is of a place and is part of that participatory democracy infrastructure of that community. And I think that by wiring it in like that to say that these are, you have certain expectations of governance around something which is a community asset like that, and that you've not got a group of people who are well-minded citizens trying to do the right thing, but you link that into the conversation about what are we trying to do for our community much more strongly. Now, how that stacks up is that you will very quickly see that for many boards of governors is that they've got some common concerns. So, for example, I think most boards, hopefully any decent board of governors realises that we're not educating kids for the jobs which are actually going to exist. You know, we're educating kids for a 20th century economy, and that doesn't exist anymore, for example. But if you've got that real local focus on that, you've got some real energy about how do you elevate that up to not in terms of what's government going to do for us, but how are we going to solve that problem. And when you think about the link between education and economic growth, then I think that that's very powerful, because what you've got, instead of everybody sitting there waiting for government to come up with some policy, central government to come up with some policy that's going to solve that problem, you're bringing it up from the grassroots and saying, what are we going to do here? Because we want to make sure that our kids are going to get jobs. And you know what? We'd like to make sure they're going to get jobs around here.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just push that.
Yeah.
So I feel good on a local level, but obviously Kirklees got 23 high schools across the patch. So how do we then link those common themes across, you know, areas of relative affluence, relative deprivation, so we're getting actually better educational outcomes for the 100,000 people who live in our patch?
So to what extent in the Commission have you been exploring the fact that you need to have a conversation about social contract and citizenship? So that actually that there should be a conversation about what do we expect of citizens as well as what do we expect of representatives.
It's very much part of the core of the work. The problem is that you get that contradictory answer where you sort of say, well, I want the council to do everything, and I also want to do lots myself. You know, you sort of find there isn't a neat cut-off point between those two issues.
Yeah. So I think that So this is where I draw on my digitalness, which is that, so in a digital environment, one of the ways in which you would solve that dilemma is that, and this is digital with a mindset, not necessarily the tech, is that you make the evidence base open and accessible to everybody, and you provide constant feedback around what's actually going on in the environment, you gamify it. So what you would do is you would make extremely visible to those 23 high schools the fact that actually some are succeeding, some are failing, in a way that we don't do very well. Ofsted doesn't do that very well. League tables don't do that very well. There are much better ways of Progress 8 is a really interesting measure around education, for example. Some things where you would be able to identify which are the maths teachers in Kirklees who are really nailing it on Progress 8, for example, would be very powerful. And so, by on the one hand saying, we're really committing to giving you the power to make your communities better, and giving the people the constant data about these are the people who we're leaving behind, you make it very difficult for people to be unreasonable about how you're managing resources, because you've made the inequality really transparent. And the thing is, and then they become terribly unreasonable, and that's why we still need the representative democracy layer.
Yeah, it's something about using that model then for us as local councillors to challenge, well, because basically if our academies are controlled by central government, not by us. So. Yeah,
and it's ridiculous now, and now because destroying the local education authorities and then rebuilding it in these multi-academy trusts is all very mad policy making from central government.
Yeah, I'm glad you
Moving on.
Moving on.
Lost into
no, sorry.
Is that
an example? Well, it's about. Well, I can go down the list. We've talked a little bit about health earlier on. We can talk about environment. Well, employment.
So
we can apply the same question.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
So I think the destructive test for anything that you're looking at is the hospital closure test, which is where actually often the NHS will be making very reasonable forward-looking decisions about the fact that you need one acute trust and not two in a particular locality, and that the way and local democracy ends up in a completely oppositional and negative opinion about that. And I know you guys handled this conversation quite differently on your patch quite recently, and that's quite, which is another reason why you guys are interesting. But is that to be able to hold an evidence-based, rational conversation with the public about something as emotive as that closing a hospital conversation, which actually is, the NHS is evidence-based around that stuff. And you know what? We kill fewer people if we change the way in which we use those things. But nobody cares about that. They care about where's my local hospital. So being able to say, would take the approach that I'm saying around putting evidence at the beginning of the process and common understanding, and then feeding back in, you really do want to be killing people like this? you know, is the...
It's a good front page in the paper.
Are you sure you want to carry on killing people? You know, you change the nature of the conversation.
Which brings us nicely into your key expertise and what you want to draw on digital platforms, the way that can happen. And one of the things that is constant what we're talking to citizens is that they feel that there's a lack of communication, there's a lack of the kind of information they want in the format that they want. How can digital platforms aid that in a successful way?
So, I mean, immeasurably, people are connected and are informed, and people get information, but they get it. You know, there is no, there's no sense that people who, once they're digitally included, they're not getting the flow of data. You know, they're not getting a flow of content coming towards them. The difficulty for government is how do you make your content interesting enough so that they choose to include it in the overwhelming feed of stuff that they've got, and also how do you draw a distinction between that and the cat videos, which is what they might be filling their feed with. In my case, it's dog pictures. I'm a dog person, not a cat person. So I'm now going to bore you around so I got in, my research comes from a place which is I was very, very fascinated and still fascinated by the relationship between social media and democratic participation, and the fact that people are more and more active using social media, and that we do have, we have a democratic deficit, and we have people falling out of the traditional democratic processes. And the current turbulence around party political membership notwithstanding, it will remain to see whether or not the surge in participation that happened around June is going to continue through. So I started off looking, how do we use social media to do democracy? And I spent a long time looking at that before, and in fact, Carl was one of my failed experiments around this. Thank you, Carl. And where I ended up at the end of my doctoral stuff, and I am still researching, is that we do not have civic spaces online. We have commercial spaces, we have transactional government spaces, and we have social spaces, but we don't have spaces which are designed to support the public sphere, and where it is a necessary condition that you will encounter someone who's different to you. Facebook, for example, is all about keeping you attracted by showing you people who are just like you. It's that, and that's no way to build a community. That's a way of separate. That's a way of creating gated communities of people who are deeply separate from each other. So I believe that if we want to really get a digital solution around democracy, we need to think seriously about building civic architecture online. So imagine the village green, or the village or the market square, or how you're reimagining high streets, and how you're thinking about, I'm pretty sure you're not the kind of people who are putting spikes in doorways and things like that. You're not the kind of people who, I don't know, have you ever been to Blue Water, the shopping centre?
Yes, unfortunately.
Okay, so Blue Water, have you noticed that it's deeply demographically segregated, because all of the nice middle class brands are in one wing, and all the Primark stuff is in another wing, and then there's kind of like weird stuff that the teenagers do in another bit, and the only unifying force is John Lewis.
The food court in John Lewis, isn't it? Yes.
Now, that's how the internet is working for us at the moment. Is that it's not bringing communities together. What it's doing is it's segmenting them based on what they're going to buy. And when you design the public realm, you're not trying to create gated communities. You're not trying to segment people. You're not trying to keep this type of person here and that type of person there. You want to bring them together. So we have to design places online where people will come together. That can't be the council, because that's where people are transacting with you. So what I'm exploring is for example, a library is a natural civic hub. It's a natural place where you would bring people together. Is that what does the digital space around a library look like, and how do you consider that to be a knowledge creation space? Because if the digital surround of a library is a knowledge creation space, then it's a brilliant foundation for how you're going to get into that democracy, evidence-based democracy conversation that we're just talking about. So I'm really interested in how do you create sort of almost like a civic passport, which is not just your transactional relationship with the council, but is your identity as a citizen, which is used by something like the library, but it would also be used as participatory budgeting. It would be used probably if you were, if you were a school governor and you wanted to get an information flow from the local authority, all of that kind of stuff. But this sense that we have a relationship between the state and the citizen, which is not about the services that they receive, it's about them being active in their community.
How do you see the role of the councillor?
So the councillor, I believe, because I believe that this democracy ought to be organised around natural place, is that you ought to have representatives of those natural places. And I believe that one of the advantages that digital ought to, I don't know if you come across the Stephen Coleman phrase, direct representation. Yeah, so what Coleman was talking about is that sort of in this world of the networked individual and the fact that it's all about me in the 21st century, is that people want a representative, but they want a sense of direct connection to the representative. And that's what digital can offer. And so by creating these civic spaces and by making sure that the elected representative is visible in those, as is the deliberative conversation that's going on, all those kind of things, and active citizens, digital makes it quite easy for the member to have line of sight to what's going on in that natural place.
Yeah, that's it. Just one other question on that. It is the old perennial in many ways, which of course is that there is a sizable minority of non-digital warriors out there. Now that might change, and that will change. Obviously, in generations' time, it will seem like a rather archaic question. We are in a moment of transition. How do they become part of this sort of digital civic space?
So I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this at the moment. So firstly, digital inclusion is different to what it was when we started. Or digital exclusion is different to what it was when we started talking about this. Because when we started talking about digital, it was questions of affordability and access. And now it's much more likely to be about motivation, trust and skills. And all of those things we can solve. There are very, very, very few people who do not have a smartphone at this point. There are very few people who, even if they can't do it directly, they don't have a family member who can do it. And we need to keep working to make sure everybody is included. But actually, this is not the problem that we originally started talking about around digital inclusion.
It's just a question of signposting and giving people...
but I think it's a question of, and this links to the sort of the framing of what happened in June, which is that we are in the process of leaving a whole group of people behind in the 20th century. So as we make this big shift from 20th to 21st century, from industrial to network society, there's a whole bunch of people that we're in the process of leaving behind because we're going to automate their jobs and we're going to shift the way in which their communities work, and we are going to put stuff online because we can't afford to not to. And I think there's a real responsibility for government to for all of us to figure out how do we make sure that we make the 21st century relevant to those people. And you know what? I think that includes your staff as well, because unless you've made sure that your staff are feeling digitally competent and confident and evangelistic, they are not going to help the residents. Every single contact with a member of the public ought to be a chance to check, are you able to participate in the 21st century? And digital is almost like a follow-on to that. So this question about, are we helping people understand why their place in this new world is almost one of the biggest questions for government right now. And that for me is the democracy question, which is how do we, we have failed to connect to a whole bunch of people who don't think that how the world is changing has a place for them.
So how do we do, we've got a whole group of older people who are using email, using physical access to everything. What I've got is my large number of elderly people who are clearly not.
Yeah.
And so they're going to be, as time goes on, that group will get smaller. You'll get people in their 80s and 90s who are using iPads and smartphones and whatever new bit it's going to be.
So I think never underestimate the power of Granny, because like Granny Lust will get many, many people online. You know, this kind of like, don't teach them to fill forms out, teach them how to Skype their grandchildren. That kind of stuff is amazingly effective.
Right.
And so often we make this assumption that because people are a certain age that they're not going to be interested in this stuff.
Yeah,
but really, what we've not done is given them anything interesting to do. I mean, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't turn up to learn how to fill out a form, but I'm pretty sure I would. You know, there's other things. Do you see what I mean? It's just.
Well, no, yeah, because I'll have my 12-year-old showing an 85-year-old how to do whatever Fruit Ninja.
Yeah.
Because actually,
touchscreen Tinder then really.
Actually, touchscreen technology is actually much more accessible for the elderly than keyboard stuff. So they could do.
And also there's a group. So sort of at this moment, as sort of the people who are in their 50s and 60s are going in and arranging care for their parents who are in their 70s, sort of their 70s and 80s. You've got a moment where you set that generation's expectations around what interacting around being an older person looks like.
Yeah, sure.
So we can either say your future is sitting in a circle in old people's home just like watching paint dry, or we can say if you make the effort to learn some of this stuff now, you'll be less socially isolated and you'll get more out of life for a lot longer.
I like the library stuff. You think about libraries being a digital hub?
Yeah, completely. I think
we could facilitate.
Yeah.
Which,
but I think to do that, I'm more of a mind that libraries need to be a blended use space, with intergenerational activities going on. I'd like to see co-working and hot desking and job seekers, because they all actually need the same kind of infrastructure, but you bring them together into the same kind of space. And I'm very keen that we don't have those sad banks of ancient PCs which we make people who are digitally excluded use because that will help them. We need to make sure that we're offering people the best of technology in those places, not the kind of the stuff that the rest of us have discarded.
Manchester Central Library kind of gets that. It's not quite there, but it's an interesting space.
Yeah. The Hive in Worcestershire is another one to look at, and the new Stafford Library as well. Yeah.
That would work, because the interesting thing is schools are now, you have banks of laptops or tablets which they borrow. There's potential for that to move on, isn't there?
Digital exclusion. I know we look at it as if people don't have the equipment, but they also don't have the vital tools and literacies and skills. And recently this week, it was at the age range between 30 and 40 where they can't read. And I feel that you can have as much equipment as you want, but if they're unable to read what it says on the screen, that's a barrier. And are we looking at ways of...
Yeah, completely. So firstly is that the plain English campaign people continue to be right, and that we put a lot of nasty council language on websites and things like that. So we do need to make sure that we're fitting within a reasonable literacy requirement rather than overcomplicating stuff, which I think we do a lot. And if you think about committee minutes, which should be a route into a democratic conversation for some people if they were interested in finding out more, they're really inaccessible. So there's all of that, but I think that now I'm a written word kind of person, but even I am admitting that what you're starting to see is a shift to using video so much more, and that people will, that being able to give evidence, like giving evidence via video and things like that, and people learning from that rather than just the controlled report. That's a big shift, and younger people use multimedia a huge amount. And so, as we're designing, whatever you end up designing, it should be a multimedia thing. So I'm assuming that your final report will have a video aspect to it as well as a written aspect to it. I'm pretty sure Diana's going to make sure that's going to happen. Yeah, but So I'm not saying these aren't real issues, but they're not the issues that they were when they first surfaced 10 years ago. Is that the question about how do we make sure everybody gets the most out of digital remains, but the answer to that question is profoundly different to how it was when we all started worrying about it. And I think and this is why I get a bit wound up about it, because I get wound up, which is like, old people can learn about technology if it's interesting enough.
I agree.
Yeah. But also that that we can do things differently in a way which is much more accessible to a lot of people, and the people that inconveniences are the people who've already got a lot of privilege. So to shift you know, so if my council were to shift towards using more video and sort of a more kind of a more approachable style of delivery, sort of like overly educated middle class me would be going, what's going on? More people than I would be included by that, than I would be felt uncomfortable. The thing is that I'm the kind of person who makes a fuss about it, so you don't make those kind of changes. I don't actually, I'd be very supportive. Tell them, if you see Horsham, let them know.
That links in, because this morning, about user interface design, really good quality design, and that links in with, you know.
Is that the FutureGov guys? Yeah.
But it's about the user. We think about it being technology, but it isn't the whole the system. About how you interface with the civic space or whatever. As long as it's well designed, and
exactly. And
people don't necessarily think about it.
And where again, when we all started saying, "Oh, these computers, what are they doing?" is that actually it was engineers building them, and it was, you know, and it was very zeros and ones and clunky, and the computer did what the computer did. Is that you don't have to put up with that anymore. It will do what you want it to do, as long as you prioritise the need of the actual user. But, and this is what you know, this is when I say design in democracy is quite a profound statement. So, for example, when you're redesigning your website, it's quite easy for the personas that you build that on to be customer personas. So a customer is always right. You know, it's a cliche. A customer wants to get in and out as fast as possible. You know, a customer has certain expectations around quality. How different does a citizen persona look in interacting with that website? So do you ask them at the end about the quality of their customer experience, or do you ask them about how they could make that thing better for somebody else? You know, so you're designing in democracy is designing the expectation that you're going to treat people like citizens, because they're certainly not going to behave like citizens if you treat them like consumers. And I would argue that the whole sort of thing about new public management and the way in which local government has moved in the last 20 years has been all about ending up in this place as we've created consumers.
Very contractual
relationship, isn't it? Because one of the things we get is about our council, Kirklees, is somebody else. It's not our council. It's that playing into that. So it's same as Sainsbury's.
It really does. Completely. And think about the difference in the way that the Co-op or John Lewis behave, which are, you know, sort of mutuals and, you know, different kind of models of organisations compared to a Tesco or who knows how Lidl works actually. There is a thing though here, which is that, and Carl and I have explored this before, which is that there is a big change in what I'm saying required on the representative, because what you're doing is creating an environment where it is impossible to ignore the citizen. And sometimes, because we don't spend the time, we don't have the time on that deliberative layer, is that sometimes the representative does shortcut that, okay, we can't reconcile this, I'm going to take a decision. And the visibility and the constant connectedness of what I'm suggesting is work for the elected representative. Now, I think it delivers back in terms of increased, you know, you've got a stronger mandate, you've got a stronger sense of connection to the people you're representing, and I think you can, when you understand what people are saying, you're able to move faster. But I sort of want to balance off the design in loads of democracy, but be careful what you wish for, because you can't design in loads more democracy and then expect people to be satisfied if you don't listen to them.
But is the citizen always right?
No, they're not, and the individual citizen is not always right. Because they're not customers; they're citizens. You know.
Which, well, again, some of the issues just a feeling about discussions we've had as councillors about interacting with difficult residents, and we've had some really good conversations about that's a judgment you make as an experienced councillor. You know, when do you stop interacting? Do you actually say, I'm sorry, enough is enough, and that's not a productive interaction for us? And managing that time, and sometimes you get huge amounts of time invested in individuals who complain, and you want to, it's that customer interaction, and actually saying, well, actually...
It also raises a question around leadership. And in a way, it sort of leads very nicely into that. You know, in what ways does this problematise that sense of, you know, community leadership, and what ways can it enhance?
So I think it's, in terms of problematizing it, is that what you end up with is that you end up with this tension between the people who are the natural leaders who just like getting stuff done and the people who've got a real respect for the process and understand this idea that they're not always right and that democracy is not about always being the person who wins. Democracy is about the process, and it's about us coming to the best possible solution given the fact we all don't necessarily agree with each other. And I think a really good way of... So I've got a lot of... I have a lot of, not scepticism is the wrong word, so I have a concern around social innovation. So social innovation, where kind of like entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs go in there and solve problems. So they'll go in there and they'll kind of do radical childcare, or they'll kind of like, stuff like the Good Gym, or they'll go in and so brilliant projects, incredible edible in your neck of the woods. Yeah. So these kind of social innovations of kind of like doing things which previously the council might have done, but doing them differently. Very powerful people in the spaces in which they operate, very, very energising, and they understand this digital world, so they can be really, really effective a lot of the time. Good social innovators will be really effective. If you can't engage them, though, in the fact that democracy is more than just them doing something that they think is right, and that is increasingly difficult because people are not attracted to political parties, and because the way in which our formal democracy operates feels very slow, cumbersome and exclusive to those people. I think the problematisation here is that those kind of people are not satisfied by the current democratic process, and that sets up a real tension around making change happen locally. And the only sort of like check that I can think of on that is around inclusion and representativeness, about demonstrating who they're reaching and who, by implication, they're not reaching. So one of the reasons I'm really keen on this idea of a digital civic space is it's a lot easier to know who's not there. So you'll know with a lot more certainty who are the people who are not being reached by these activities. Whereas at the moment, those sort of like those social innovators can capture a space without having any democratic checks and balances about whether or not they're actually representing the will of that whole community.
Potentially ride roughshod over stuff that's already happened.
Yeah, and the thing is, you don't want to kill that energy. So I'm a non-exec for something called Space Hive, which is a civic crowdfunding platform. Very fascinating, because I really like these participatory tools. But Space Hive is really clear that it knows who's there and it knows who's not, and it knows its relationship to the bigger democratic process. But in terms of a tool that gets people directly engaged and involved, it's a brilliant tool. But it has to sit within a democratic structure, because it's actually all about how you're using physical space a lot of the time, and that is much more complicated than any one community is going to solve.
So what was it called? In Space?
Space Hive. So does that kind of like, so that's
no, that is, I think you raise the problems, the challenges, and the potential opportunities. They are in many ways, as ever was, just in a different format. In other ways, they are very particular towards this notion, this type of interaction.
So I think that the sort of, one spends quite a lot of time thinking about what's different about digital, if you're really anyway. And the what's different about digital is about pace and visibility. It is easier, and as a result, change happens much faster because code is more throwaway. You don't have to print a load of flyers, walk them round, get people to a meeting. You can be gathered online in a second. But also that activity is very, very visible to people in a way that some other organising and the discrete parts of democracy are quite important. But digital makes those discrete bits of democracy more difficult. That kind of like that, you say the same. If you're a politician of integrity, you say the same thing to everybody, but you don't say it in the same way.
That's where you communicate with in a language they understand.
Yeah, but online that becomes a really difficult thing because you don't have that control over how you present yourself, and so as a result, that is one of the other drivers towards this participation stack, which is you actually need the evidence base to behave in a slightly different way for you.
Yeah, it is interesting that evidence is integral to this whole process, isn't it? It creates a wider deliberative culture. pace is a really interesting thing. It's interesting just talking to you. Then I worked with Rachel Gibson and Steve Ward many, many years ago when political parties first went onto the internet and started to design websites. I've not thought about it for a while, but I was listening to you then, quite how quickly, we did the survey in 2001 and the changing website now is so that pace is going to continue. It's not going to disappear.
It's not going anywhere.
How do we bring councillors of different backgrounds, of different experiences, and different abilities forward in a way that reflects that pace?
So I had a crack at this. So I designed something. I did some research and designed something called the Network Councillor Programme a few years ago, which we did with you guys. Yeah. So we did. Yeah. And I think that there was a lot of good stuff in that. I think where I would do it differently now, though, is that firstly I would really focus on digital leadership literacies rather than the tools that you use, like Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. People got very confused between, show me how to use Twitter, that's all I need, and me saying, I think you need to understand how this world works. So I think that you need to get people to agree to spend some time thinking about this epoch shift, but we don't have to use that word, but the fact that understand some of the underlying drivers which are going on here. And the reason that you need that is that the technology will continue to change. And if we just train people to use technology, they are not going to be able to move at the pace which is required. You can't be freaked out every time a new social media platform turns up, or The Guardian changes its model, or the Telegraph again. You can't. You have to be able to understand the change as a constant that digital brings. So that would be the one thing, and that needs people to spend a bit of time learning and engaging with that question. And it will come, you could bring it with, I know we talk about the ageing population, but let's talk about what people who are 50 today are really going to experience at the age of 70. So to throw the technology futures forward a bit. So there's lots of ways in which you can use the social shifts that people are already talking about in order to connect into this digital network society stuff. So that's one thing. The other thing is you need to get the political parties around the table and say, look, love, we really do need this to come from both directions. It has to come through the parties as well, because political parties are still very strong tribal structures with elected representatives, and however turbulent they are at the moment, that's not going to change for a while. I must say, because it may be the undoing of you all, because the political party structure is not your friend with respect to connecting to a lot of the electorate, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I think that sort of tension has come out in a number of things.
I know, I get into a lot of trouble with this because people who are tribal about their political parties don't like the idea that the model's a bit broken.
But local branding works as well.
Yes.
Local. So the way the party gives people a general idea of what they're about. And it's that local, so use an individual and also team, the local team from Conservative or Democrat.
But everybody can see though that however engaged and active that local team is, and however good that local team is about community activism, they see no connection between what goes on there and what happens in Westminster, and that's why it gives people trouble.
That's because there's very little connection.
and that's why the political party structure does no favours to local democracy.
Disagree with that.
Discuss. I feel like
that's one for the pub.
It's one for my returning students. I think I might just think with that. I'm afraid I've got to go and dash to Manchester. I've got to go and pack, and I've got an aeroplane at 7 o'clock in the morning to go on holiday. So
quite right too.
But it all seems a little bit too rushed. But have you got any more questions?
No.
I have a sense in which this won't be the last time we're going to be contacting you and relating with you. Not only has that been fascinating, but it's also probably created more challenges than it's solved, and that is an excellent piece of evidence. That is how it should be. Because it really does make us think, and I think this notion of democracy stuff is one that I'd like to explore a little bit more and thinking about it in practical terms, how that can be realised.
I've got some bits and pieces I've written about it as well, so I can they're
If you could send that to Carl,
yeah.
you could send that around. I think that really would be healthy.
Send us the video as well as that.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a picture. The democracy stack is currently a picture. I haven't gone as far as video.
Oh, is it?
No, I drew it. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that available?
Yeah. So basically, everything I do research-wise is on my blog, so it's all out in the universe. So Curious Catherine, but I'll send you the links. Yeah. Curious by name and nature.
That's how it should be. It's nice to see. Not you see that all that next thing with impact. If you know what I mean, yes, everything is impact.
Really nice. Yeah, no, but I do hope. I'm really, thanks for doing this. To be honest, because somebody needs to. So if I can help, give me a shout.
This is a starting point. The Northern Westminster stuff continues anyway. I think that the plans are for that for next February, are they? So I think that one of the things that I'm always impressed with Kirklees, Carl and his team and the councils is that they are asking difficult questions in an acceptance that the answers aren't just easy. My vice chancellors, I'm sure most vice chancellors talk about the low-hanging fruit of life and whatever, and you appear to
ignore that and climb to the top of the tree.
I think there's much to be commended in that approach, but it's been a long 2 days, and that's been a fabulous way to end it, to be honest. It genuinely gives us a spark.
Well, I can't wait to hear what else you guys have been hearing, because it does sound like you've had a really great collection of voices.
Well,